back.
Well, you're back. Yeah. Welcome back.
Coming and going.
I had a bunch of things today that I don't know. I'm being lazy. Well, I got here and I realized there are no coffee makers when here, so I took the task upon myself and immediately messed it up. Well, I thought the coffee machine was done. It wasn't. It just had taken a brief pause, so I pulled the crap out and then it started the dumb happening. So I had to get up. And then I realized that we're switching over to the new YouTube channel today, so I had to change all the settings in my laptop. Luckily, by the grace of God, it all worked the first time. So who knows where this is going right now? If it's going to the church's YouTube channel, or we'll find out later. All right. I am so excited about this. I want to leave that up. So for those of you that were here last week, we'll do a little bit of a recap. For those that weren't, we'll do a little bit of a recap. We are now talking about the history of the church. Keep in mind our timeline. I don't know if I wrote this down this time, but we started talking last week about 300 years before Christ, so around 300 BCE. And you guys, when I say that, you're aware of the new terminology, right? Yeah, it used to be BC and AD. Well, before Christ, Anno Domini, right? Anno Domini, yeah, the year of our Lord.
What does common era mean?
So this is the new post-Christian language. So now it's before Common Era and Common Era. And I don't know. I think current era makes more sense, I guess.
It was in common with our Jewish. That's what was in common. Is that we had this time.
The shared calendar.
Right.
Okay.
You say the Messiah has come, and we say, the jury's out.
So when I say BCE, it's used to be BC, right? And CE instead of AD. And it's funny how long it takes to phase things like that out. Even in modern publications, I still find the BC AD being used. I'm like, that's wrong. So we started last week at about 300 BCE thereabouts, right? And so what we talked about is all of the context that leads up to the beginning of Christianity. Specifically, we were talking about the influence of Hellenism on Israel and on Judaism, right? So end of the exile, the return of the Hebrew people from Babylon to Jerusalem, rebuilding of the kingdom. The Persian Empire kind of takes over, but the beginning of Hellenism is marked with the arrival of Colin Farrell. Alexander the Great. You guys, again, nobody saw that movie. So the Greek influence, even though Alexander was Macedonian, he's bringing this, what we might call Western culture, as in European culture, into the world of Mesopotamia, into the world of the Egyptians and the Assyrians and the Hebrew people, and people whose hair is curly and whose skin is darker, and who have a completely different way of seeing the world than Alexander and his books. So we talked about how Hellenism influences how the Hebrew people think, how they see themselves. We talked about, I don't know if you remember, Pliny of Alexandria, who was one of those early guys that was trying to reconcile Hellenistic philosophy with Hebrew scripture and Hebrew thought. And then we walked through that. We talked about the significance of that, both culturally, philosophically, and theologically. And we talked about diaspora Judaism, right? So we talked about the significance of the impact of Greek culture, but also the Roman Empire and its creation of roads and safety, and not just on roads, but Paul does many sea journeys during the course of his ministry, and the only threat he ever faces is storms, right? Doesn't have to deal with pirates or things like that. So what impact does that have on Judaism? Well, one of the things that it does is it provides the opportunity for people who, prior to the access provided by the Roman Empire, most likely would not have left the land from which they came, right? And again, I'm making a bit of a generalization there, but kind of the contrast is even now, in 2023, where we have interstates, airports, right? I have so many friends that have never left Alpena County. Acquaintances, and this isn't a critique on them, they were friends, but I haven't talked to them in 20, 30 years, right? So even now, right, people tend to kind of stay where they're from. There's an impetus, there's a activation energy to get out of that. Well, imagine living in a world where traveling beyond your borders, beyond the boundaries of your tribe was dangerous, right? To be a foreigner was dangerous. So what the empire does, amongst all of its negative impact, is it provides the opportunity for people to leave, okay? And they do leave. In fact, Jews, Hebrew people, spread all over the Roman Empire. And the reason that this is important, the reason why the diaspora of Judaism is important is because when Christianity begins, when the message of Christ spreads, it spreads primarily, initially, amongst Jewish communities, right? So this is, one of the misconceptions often is that the early people who were spreading Christianity resembled church planters in our understanding of that type of evangelism, where how did our denomination spread? Well, kind of similarly, it spread where there were Scandinavians and Germanic peoples, immigrants who had come to the United States. But in our mindset, how did this church get formed? Well, there was a pastor who came and started a church, right? But he went and knocked on the doors of the people who had Scandinavian last names, right? Well, it wasn't just some random person bringing the light of Christ into the dark barbarian hinterlands. The way that Christianity spread early was from Jewish community to Jewish community, right? And so what Paul was, in addition to being somewhat of an evangelist, is Paul was really an administrator in a lot of ways. The letters that he's writing to these early Christian communities are letters about practical things, about conflicts that exist within those churches, about theological disputes. He does a lot of clarification around different ideas, right? And I'm characterizing this, but I want us to understand the importance of that diaspora and the effect that it has, both on Judaism, but then the fertile ground that it lays for Christianity when Christianity comes back. So, where does that take us? Well, we're up into the end of the post-resurrection timeline. Where are we going? Okay, is we're going another 300 years into the future, eventually, not today. This is going to take a few weeks. But where we're going to wind up is around 313 common era, 313, 314, something like that. And we might decide to go a little bit further, but this takes us right up to when Constantine comes on the scene, which I have to admit, when I went back and did my reading, did not occur the way that I remember it occurring. Constantine, believe it or not, comes out of this, well, and I'm spoiling a little bit, we'll get to this in a few weeks, but comes out of this weird era of Roman politics called the Tetrarchy. You heard of this? Where there were actually 4 emperors, kind of. Yeah. And Constantine comes out of the conflict that results from that poor idea. It doesn't last very long. It essentially lasts the duration of one administration, and it crumbles. So that's where we're going to go. And the reason that we're headed towards this goal is that by the time we get to 313, we get past the last great persecution. The last great persecution. So again, another one of the common myths. Well, I shouldn't say it that way. One of the things that tends to be surprising is that we tend to think of the persecutions that happened to Christianity either on this idea that they were being persecuted from 30 Common Era all the way up to 313 Common Era, which they weren't, or that the majority of the persecutions is front-loaded, when in reality, some of the greatest persecution that Christianity experiences actually comes just before Constantine, by a guy named Galerius. Interesting dude. We'll get there. We're not there yet. So what happens is at the end of that last great conflict, Constantine passes what is called the Edict of Toleration, right? Which is kind of the stepping stone whereupon Christianity finally becomes the de facto religion for the Roman Empire. It's a little bit more complicated than that, right? It's not like, in the same way that when King Olaf converted Norway to Lutheranism, it doesn't happen overnight. It's a slow process that involves a lot of bloodshed. So that's where we started. This is where we're going. This week, we're going to pick up where we left off, in that we're talking a little bit more about the importance of the Greco-Roman world, so understanding this world that Christianity comes out of. And again, these contexts that exist that Christianity springs up in. So we talked about the Roman Empire as a political entity. Let's talk about it a little bit as a religious entity, and some of the shifts that are taking place in the Roman Empire's theological world while Christianity is becoming a thing. So, what do we know about Roman religiosity? It's not a test. We can spitball here.
A lot of different gods.
Yeah, one of the words that I erased up here was the word syncretism, right? I'll put that back up.
And didn't they adopt a lot of the gods that the Greeks had?
They did.
Except they gave them different names.
They did, yeah. And this is kind of the interesting thing, is that in our perspective, Christianity, monotheistic religion, I'm using language here. We follow the one true God in our thought world. Okay. So how do we often refer to the people that early Christians encountered? How do we refer to the religion of the Roman Empire? What word do we use?
Polytheism.
Well, that's certainly one word. Paganism, yeah. Polytheism. This is a modern term. But paganism. We refer to basically everything that's not us as this. But what's interesting is the word pagan actually has its roots in rural culture, right? So pagans were the people who yokels, kind of. That's not an exact one-to-one translation, but that's where this word comes out of, right? And so paganism was actually a term originally that was used by Romans to describe the salt of the earth kind of, I don't know how to describe it. The religion of the people that come from the boundaries,
Wouldn't that be the kind of thing they would describe, say, the Germans and the primitive people like the Druids?
Yes.
The British Islands?
Absolutely.
Like that.
Yeah, the barbarian hordes,
Yeah.
the Goths and the Visigoths and the Gauls and the Gaels and the Celts and all that. But what's important in thinking about this is how that perspective is actually reversed. So we, as modern Christians, talk about the religious practices of the Roman Empire as paganism. We throw it into this big basket as if everybody not us is this, okay? Which we stole this term. We didn't invent this term, okay? Right? This was the term that was used by the Romans to describe others. But what's remarkable, again, that we need to change our thinking on, is that the Romans, right, understood their religious practices as the orthodoxy, and not just orthodoxy. Orthodoxy is this big multi-syllabic word which means right belief, right? Right faith. Not only did they understand their practice as orthodoxy, but one of the major kind of fear-mongering things that comes out of the rise of Christianity is, number one, monotheistic, and exclusively monotheistic, right? In other words, Christianity makes this claim that God, Jesus is the one true Lord. None others can exist beside him. And which essentially says that Christianity, at least in this context, is a denial of the state-sponsored religion. And state-sponsored is the wrong word here, okay? It's the religion of the people of Rome, okay? So they, and I've referenced this before, they thought of Christians as atheists because they were against God, right? They denied the reality of the divinity of basically the Roman religion. Okay, let's get back to oh, and by the way, feel free to chime in.
Well, I think it's important to say that it's also the Jewish community said of us that we were atheistic, meaning that we no longer were monotheistic in saying that Jesus was God.
Oh man, and well, next week or the week after, we're going to get fully into Gnosticism and fully into this struggle around like how do we define the Trinity while still maintaining our identity as a monotheistic peoples. Right. It's really fun. It gets really, really convoluted.
And we sound very paganistic.
We sound very paganistic to the Jewish orthodoxy,
sure.
Right? We have chosen to follow this different God, this human being, Jesus, who was a criminal, and at best was a failed revolutionary within the Jewish community, right? So
I also think it's important to say that the Romans would have been perfectly happy, with the Christian claim if it had just been toned down.
Oh, 100%.
Jesus was a very nice guy.
100%. 100%.
Yeah. Because then you wouldn't have really bothered with all the implications of not having Caesar be the main influence in civilization.
Yeah. And that Caesar piece is where we run into issues. And we'll come back to that.
Right. But I think to their credit, they realized that religion and state crafting, state creation, political power goes hand in hand. You can't separate it out as nicely as we think we have in North America in the last couple hundred years. It doesn't separate that easily. And it wasn't separate to them.
No.
In other words, you couldn't really, when the Roman cop stopped you in the street, you needed to appear civilized to that person.
Yeah.
And that all the way up to, okay, fine that you have your God, that's good, cool, all right, but Caesar is really the thing we were interested in here. Your adherence to, because we're the civilizing power, and you really are not.
Yeah, and we talked about this last week. The word civilization carries a connotation, but one of the things that Justo Gonzalez makes a claim on is that civilization in Rome essentially equates to cityfication. In other words, the creation of urban communities. And
the pagans were not the urban.
Exactly. And for a Christianizing influence, which denies one of the foundations of what Rome understands to be the foundation of civilization, means that we're not only religiously outliers, we are now a threat to the civilization, right? We are terrorists almost in that regard. We are dangerous, right?
That's why you crucify.
Yep.
Another thing that's interesting, I think, about Greek and Roman religious practices is that, you had this whole set of gods, and along with that, there were the myths.
Yeah.
That came with that.
Oh yeah.
They told themselves. And if you think about it, I'm not sure about the numerous gods part of it, but the if you're raising a family or a child, and as the children grow up, they hear these stories of these myths, and so, I mean, Greek and Roman myths are tremendous literature.
Yeah.
And they carry with them great lessons of life.
Absolutely.
And the kinds of things that a society tries to, just implant within their citizens as this is how you be a good citizen. You put up a story of a god, or it's like the guy that looked at his reflection in the pond.
Yeah. Narcissus.
And said, you can end up in a bad place by doing this.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I mean, we can even carry that to today, and say, you need to be a little bit careful about looking at yourself in the mirror and thinking, man, I got it. You know what I mean?
And the story of Narcissus is one of my favorites because it also betrays one of the ways in which we misunderstand narcissism. Is Narcissus doesn't fall in love with himself; he falls in love with the image of himself. Right. The image that he sees in the pond, which may or may not be the real him. Right. Mm-hmm. Which that's another study.
If you think about the whole system, the whole structure of how they did that, I mean, it's actually not a bad way. If you're an intelligent, I don't think they did this. There wasn't one person that said, this is how we're going to structure our society.
Yeah.
It's what it became, and it actually worked for them for 1,000 years, which is a long time.
Yeah, extremely long time, especially considering the breadth of how far that empire covers, not just in terms of geography, but in terms of culture.
Yeah.
Because that's arguably we're watching this happen in real time in our modern era, right? So one of the things that Western Europe is struggling with is, it's one thing to have migration, to have immigrants. It's another thing to struggle with the cultural, mixing, right? Mm-hmm. Right. So my Helen's older sister is a teacher in Eastern France, right? And her classroom is made up of almost entirely of North African Muslims, right? And one of the things is in France, France philosophically expects assimilation, right? That's the fundamental understanding, similar to the empire, is that you will learn to speak French, because if you're going to be in France, that's what French people do, right? You will adopt, some of our cultural norms. It's just what you do, and we're watching that struggle. We're watching it here as well too. One of the great anxieties that's pushing a lot of our politics is the realization that white Caucasian people will no longer be the majority in 15 years, right? Which means that we have now become a true diversity, right? We have become a true community. And one of the major drivers that people are seeing behind that diversification of the United States is the influx of people who are darker skinned Spanish speaking that are coming up from the South, right? And seeing that as a new threat. Again, we don't learn from history, despite the fact that our predecessors were seen as a threat, 150 years ago. There's a reason why when people came through Ellis Island, their names changed because they needed to fit into the culture, right? If their names couldn't be pronounced by the common person, they would change the spelling, right? As evidence, I think I told the story. My friend Adam Wang, spelled W-A-N-G, right? Not Chinese, despite the number of calls that they've gotten from people looking for long lost cousins. They're Scandinavian. It was W-O-N, it's now spelled W-O-N-G. It was spelled W-A-N-G, but again, W in Scandinavian languages is more of a V sound, so it's Van, or Vanger, you will find something. So, the Roman Empire does a really good job of it in a lot of ways. We might use the word tolerance. They're tolerant, but they use this concept of syncretism. I don't know if they would have described it that way, but basically their acceptance of other people's religion and theology, so long as they did what? As long as they participated, right, which might mean paying taxes or participating in the military. Those were two big things. And so long as they tolerated, right, everybody else's gods, right? Because, we could really get into how Rome would kind of absorb, absorb religions into its bigger concept, right? So, we talked last week about how, to imagine this conversation that's like, oh, you've got a God of the harvest, so do we, so your God is basically our God. Well, there isn't that much different from us. And so your God exists within our and just breaking down that word real quick, Pan is all, theon, theos, whatever, all gods, right? So when we use the word pantheon to describe Rome, it really is accurate because, Rome was open to pretty much every expression of religiosity so long as it mixed with everybody else's, right? Which is why Christianity is such a danger, at least from their perspective, is because we've got this, well, I'm saying we, it's not we, it's them, these people in 1st century through 4th century articulated a theology which seemed to be at odds with the theology of the state of Rome. Okay. One thing I would point out, though, is that's not intentional, okay? By which I mean, eventually, Christianity becomes a critique of empire, okay? John's Revelation is a great example of that kind of imagery, right? Of specifically, aping and subverting Roman imperial imagery in a way that proclaims the power of Jesus as triumphant over that. But Christianity, when it's a movement that's being spread from Jewish community to diaspora Jewish community, is literally just a Jewish movement that has no aspirations on challenging the might of Rome. And we even see this in the Gospels, right? When Jesus is confronted with that question, he gets handed a coin, what does he say? He said, give to God what is God's, give to Caesar what is Caesar's. That's about as non-challenging as you can get. So we have to keep in mind that early Christianity doesn't come out fighting. They don't come out throwing punches at the empire, right? It's just a movement. It's just a movement that's happening within this context. It happens later, but I would argue that it's not necessarily Christianity's fault, which we'll get to. Okay. One of the other things that we need to understand about Roman religiosity during this time period is that, again, this is kind of that overarching idea. And of course, when we think of the Roman pantheon, we think of the Greek pantheon, which is co-opted by Rome, and maybe we think of like gods from Egypt or Western, Germany or something like that. But you have to remember that the other thing that's happening during this time are the cults, right? So these various secretive Roman cults that are springing up. And when we hear the word cult, we think dangerous, right? But cults were perfectly acceptable within Rome. This was a perfectly acceptable and even celebrated practice. For example, you might have heard of the name of this guy. Does that ring a bell? Mithras? The Mithran cult, right? This was a cult that was very popular within the Roman military. There were a lot of Roman legionnaires that were attracted by the cult of Mithras for various reasons. It was things that Mithras represented. But think about it in terms of, for those of you who have served in our armed forces, and I'm using words here that I might not understand fully, but one of the things that I often hear from folks who have served in our armed forces is the idea of loyalty and camaraderie with your fellow Army, Navy, Marine, whatever branch you're serving, and how that community that you form is intentionally, I would say, pushed as the thing that ultimately you defend with your life, right? You might not die for your country, but you'll die for your compatriot, right? And within that, right, we have different units having their own sigils, right? Different units having their own mascots, right? I'm thinking of all of the during World War II, especially the different mascots that were painted on the sides of planes, marking you as a part of a unit. So, of course, you would encourage, the worship of Mithras within, the Roman military, especially if that meant, it bonded you together. And especially knowing that the Roman military is made up of a bunch of people from all over the place, right? So if you've got, conscripts, so let's say you've got, of course your officers are primarily going to be citizens, right? But you've got conscripts from Egypt, North Africa, Italy, modern day France. One of your major questions is how do you get them to behave cohesively? That's a way to do it. I don't know that it was necessarily that it wasn't intentional, but it works.
Patron saints.
Patron saints.
In the exact same way.
Yes, patron saints is a great modern example of that. Yeah. And Mithra was not the only cult. So Mithra actually comes from Iranian origin, and I've heard several well-intentioned people make the argument that modern day Christianity is essentially an offshoot of the Mithran cult because of a lot of the shared imagery, which they don't understand timelines that well. But perhaps Mithran worship does have some influence in Christianity, but it actually comes from Iran, modern day Iran.
Yeah, well, these different, with conscripts from different parts of the empire, they must have spoken different languages.
Yes.
So that must have been important.
Well, and as my understanding, and again, I'm not a Roman historian, so I can't speak authoritatively, is that kind of mixing didn't actually happen all the time. Generally, they tried to keep units of like with a Roman officer over, a loyal officer over them. So you would have, the 15th Ethiopian Legion, right, or whatever, right. Language is still an issue, but I mean, one of the things to keep in mind is that most of the known world in first century Common Era has learned to speak Greek in one form or another, right? That's how far spread the Hellenizing influence is on that area, right? So Greek has become the common language, or at least the currency language, the merchants. Latin comes later. Latin comes from the West. Yeah, Latin comes from the West, and actually, we'll eventually talk about this, but the introduction of Latin into Christian language as well, it marks a significant change and a potentially, divisive one. There were other cults. They're also called the worship of mysteries that factor in, and there's some interplay between them. They borrow elements from each other, but so I just wanted to flesh out our understanding of that. Okay.
So again,
Go.
just to make sure our use of the term cult, Christians were a little Jewish cult.
Yep.
Okay, so it's again, we don't have any superiority.
Oh yeah, that's a great point.
At all. We are just another cult to be administered by Rome.
Yeah.
As long as Rome rules the Mediterranean and the rest of the known non-barbaric, non-heathen, non-pagan world.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that's exactly how they would have been seen. That's exactly how the empire would have originally viewed it. It's another cult of the mysteries, but this time it's coming out of those Jewish folks.
So I also want to just say, from my perspective, this is so relevant to now because we are once again, I think, rightly identified by some as a Jewish cult. That we come out of that. That's our thought world. We're not. We're not as universal as we think we are. And as we, leave Christendom more and more behind every day.
Yeah.
And leave Christian influence more. We need to struggle with our cultic minority status.
That's such a good thought.
In the world, because we assume and gaslight with our assumption, I think, that, well, of course, Jesus is Lord. I mean, I just passed a sign in Montana, of all places, that said, Jesus is Lord of this valley.
Did you take a vote on that?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't even do vote.
You saw that sign somewhere?
What's it?
You saw that sign somewhere?
Oh, yeah. What?
Eastern one?
It's more Western Europe. This is between Butte and
Oh, there you go.
one of those valleys.
But this is great. This is great because we find ourselves in an interesting place right now in the United States of America, in that this is something that's been talked about in the church for years and years and years. This was one of the mantras that was repeated to me over and over and over while I was in seminary. It's Christendom is dead, right, or dying. And this is now the Christian church post-Christendom. And what we mean when we say Christendom is essentially that assumption, right, that Christianity is the de facto. It is the norm, right? That the culture and the context that Western Europe existed in for many centuries, right? Or at least they think they existed in, right? You believe differently when you think you're living in Christendom, right? Because suddenly Christianity is assumed, not practiced. And I'm being a little bit, not derogatory, that's not the right word, but being a little bit critical here, because I think this is a different study. I think Christendom was the worst thing that ever happened to Christianity. But you believe differently. And one of the things that we're struggling with right now, right, is, especially in Portland, we are absolutely the minority. Not just as Lutherans, we're definitely the minority as Lutherans, but as people who practice a faith, not even just Christianity, but people who actively practice the faith, we're way below 50%. We're closer to like 20% now. And those numbers get smaller and smaller as the day goes on. As Christians, or even let's just talk about as ELCA Lutherans, what does that mean for us? And one of the things that our church has struggled with is that many of the institutions and the systems that our denomination, but even our understanding of our faith functions on, still think we're in Christendom. They still operate as if we are the de facto. And that's kind of scary. I understand that because, many of you, I bet, can think back to a time when it wasn't necessarily that you knew that everybody that you went to school with or saw in the grocery store was Lutheran, definitely not. Or even not just Christian, but operated on the same rules that you did, right? The same cultural understandings, the same context. It's not that long ago. That is no longer the case.
Except, try that in a small town.
Yeah, oh yeah, that song that gained so much notoriety.
Right, it's the assumption that the cross and the flag are the same.
Yeah, and it's also misleading because I grew up in a very small town. I grew up in several small towns. I grew up in a concentric circle of small towns, right? And it was not nearly as uniform as so much of modern culture assumes. But the one thing, though, was that I felt comfortable in my community because I felt like we were all kind of running by the same rules, okay?
I grew up in Washington, D.C.
Oh.
In elementary school, we said the Lord's Prayer every morning, and we said a psalm every morning.
Yeah.
And it was only later when our class, we were kind of divided up, our class got together, and I realized there were quite a few Jewish kids in my school, and it must have been hard for them.
Yeah, and also think about that as well too. Is I grew up, we didn't say the Lord's Prayer, but Pledge of Allegiance, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The language of that was pretty explicit. Of course, now we've got plenty of legal arguments about what God, what defines God, and because that opened to other religions, even though it was explicitly a Christian imagery that was thrust into that poem in the mid 1940s or 1950s even. 54, yeah.
That was really close to when I was born.
Yeah.
I attribute it to my birth. I wasn't born in this country, but I was sure that
Paul Daniels was born. This is proof of divine existence. God's gift to earth, Paul Daniels, everybody.
Under God.
Under God. And again, I'm a millennial, barely. So the world is different for me. By the time I was aware of the world, I was already past the kind of that cultural era. I remember saying the Pledge of Allegiance, but when we'd stopped saying it, I didn't really even think about it. Okay. I know that this has probably been a very different experience for those of you who grew up during the time period where under God, works its way into this. And I assume that there's maybe a little bit of grief associated with having that world change, and rightly so. Rightly so.
Yeah, maybe a lot of grief.
Yeah.
I was thinking of the right wing of the United States, the extreme right wing, is very much co-opting all of that imagery and that language as their own, as opposed to all the rest of the heathens who must be somehow rooted out of America.
Yeah. And one of the things that this fits into really well in talking about our history here is it's really about a chicken and an egg in a lot of ways, which is to say that when we live in a world where the rules all seem to be the rules as agreed upon by everybody, there's kind of this built-in assumption that that's the way the rules always were, right? That we are the inheritors of the way the world should be, right? When the reality is much more complicated than that, right? That the rules that we operate under, in many cases, are invented rules, right? They're not just pulled out of a hat or pulled out of thin air, but they're rules that are placed upon us or given to us. I mean, they're not always oppressive, but they have strategy behind them, okay? So, for example, saying the Pledge of Allegiance, including the words under God, there was strategy behind that. We can talk about what's going on in the 1950s, but again, growing up in the 1980s, I didn't know that history. I just assumed the Pledge of Allegiance always included the words under God in it, and that goes all the way back to the signing the Declaration of Independence, right? That the Pledge of Allegiance existed as far back, but it didn't, right? Is that should we say that the Pledge of Allegiance is evil? No. It just understands where it comes from. One of the things that ends up being a great conflict for Christianity and it being part of Rome is the other aspect of Roman religiosity, which is emperor worship. Okay? This is not the norm. Okay? What I mean by that is from the founding of the Roman Empire, they weren't always trying to push emperor worship. Okay? So there was no attempt to deify Marcus Aurelius, right? This comes in, coincidentally, kind of around the same time that Christianity is getting going. So that first century Common Era. And there's a lot of reasons why it comes in. But a lot of it has to do with changing politics, the changing political landscape of the Roman Empire. They have started to drift away from this balance of Senate and emperor, and started to move more in the direction of emperor. Okay, so the power is being shifted in that direction. But it's also a reaction to the conquest of the Roman Empire, which is as you bring more and more and more diverse peoples in, religiously, but also culturally, one of the things that happens is you will get people, good, solid Romans, saying things like, doesn't feel like my Rome anymore. We're losing the essence of who we are. We're watering down what makes us strong in the first place. And we're going to hear about this all through the first 3 centuries, because this, even especially as the Roman Empire starts to fall apart at the seams, this is what it goes back to every time. The last great persecution, just leading up to Constantine, the last great persecution of the Christian church, comes at a time in which you're as like to have a Christian neighbor as you are to have a pagan neighbor. In other words, Christianity has become part of the fabric of the Roman Empire. And this great persecution comes out of an attempt by Diocletian and this other guy, Galerius, who was kind of the power behind the throne, whispering in Galerius' ear, that we need to return to what makes Rome strong, which is the worship of the Pantheon, right? That when we left our gods behind, that's when we started to become weak. We started to crumble. And I say this, if you were watching this on MSNBC or something, you could expect that there was a very intentional and not very subtle drawing of correlation. And yet there is correlation. In other words, we do hear similar language, and I'm not trying to allude that this is the sign of the downfall of the United States. I'm just saying, human beings do this stuff, right? This is how we behave. And it's important to understand why we behave this way and what draws it to us. So the thing that comes up, which we're going to read for the next 3 centuries, not literally, but historically, is how this grates upon Christianity, but really between the relationship between Christianity and Rome. Okay? And at the beginning, they weren't necessarily bowing down and acknowledging the emperor as the creator of the universe. No, far from it, right? That's not what this was. But there was an expectation that just like you do to the rest of your pantheon, you would make sacrifice to the emperor, which was the burning of incense before the altar of the emperor. Okay? It wasn't necessarily that you were saying the emperor was God, but he's up there. And the point of it wasn't about not confirmation. Wasn't about conformity. It was about unity. Okay, and there's a difference between the two things. It wasn't that they wanted everybody to believe the same thing, but they wanted to reunite, reclaim a sense of unity in the empire. And one of the ways that they thought they would do this, and again, there's less conscious thought behind this, right? This is something that happens over time. There's not one ministry for the promotion of the emperor that comes up with this scheme, right? But one of the things that comes out of it is pushing the worship of the empire. Well, guess what? The Christians didn't want to do that for good reasons, right? Can we understand why the Christians would not want to burn incense to the altar of the emperor, right? Is there language perhaps in our Gospels that would say that that's not a good idea, that in fact would not be what God desires of us? Yes, absolutely. So a foundational understanding of Christianity rubs up against the unification emphasis coming out of the empire at that time. And remember, we talked earlier about if you're a threat to civilization, you're a threat to the empire, right? And vice versa. So if the Christians don't want to do what everybody else is doing, it's not that big a deal. Just go buy some incense, light it on fire, set it at the altar. You don't have to believe it. You just have to do it. You just have to pretend. But that was a dividing line. They didn't want to do this. This comes up over and over and over again in the history of Christianity in those first 3 centuries, which is what happens is a new emperor or a new administration gets in power that decides that things are going poorly. They want to reclaim or return or do whatever, right? Go back to the good times, or just gain the strength of the empire again. And so what they do is they essentially throw out some kind of fidelity test, right, to their citizens. Show us that you're with us and not against us, okay? And the Christians fail every single time. They never get it right. Except this is a foretaste of the feast to come. Except that last persecution. Because the last one, they don't make them burn incense. They essentially make them say a creed. They make them say a statement of allegiance. And more than half of the Christians do it. Because it was a pretty straight up, you do it or you die. Okay, you do it. And by the way, this persecution is the one where they're throwing human beings into the rings with animals. That absolutely happened, right? But it's at the end of the 2nd century, not during Paul's time that this is happening. And so maybe more than half of those who identified as Christian in that era end up doing that in various degrees. And so one of the first tasks of the quote-unquote official Christian church, sort of, not really, it's not official yet, but one of the first tasks of the church post Galerian persecution is to figure out what to do with all of the lapsed Christians. No joke.
And how lapsed were they after all?
And that's exactly it.
Yeah.
They literally create a scale of lapsedness.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, the mom who burns the incense or says the creedal statement because her children are going to be killed if she doesn't,
That's forced.
Right.
Yeah.
That's all. And so, we so easily say, all people of all creeds, blah, 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 blah. In our culture today, without really identifying what is really being said, are we saying, well, gosh, if you want to have a fascist government, that's a creedal statement.
Yep.
And this is, I mean, again, the creed is basically a fascist creed. I mean, the word fascism actually comes from the fascia.
Fascia, yeah.
All the reeds bundled together under one, emperor.
Yeah.
And so, no, I don't believe in the fascist creed per se. So it's not that every creed is okay. We're in this luxurious time of freedom now to be able to flip off anybody with our flippant statements, and we generally do that. And we don't really take seriously what's at stake, because we don't have to.
Yeah.
You don't have to vote if you don't want to vote. Kind of thing. So I guess I see that we're in the very, very, very same boat.
Yeah.
That was floating at that time.
Yeah,
that's all.
We're all in that one boat.
Very, very much the same boat.
We're all in that one boat together. Okay, I'm going to give us a teaser for next week. Sorry, these first few weeks, we're going to burn through a lot of kind of like philosophical stuff. Like, we're thinking about the whys as much as we're thinking about the whats. There will come a point where we transition to literally just going through a timeline, okay? Because we can actually trace the formation of Christianity right alongside who's emperor at the time, right? That's a pretty good timeline to track, okay? And you can see the growth and the dwindling of Christianity depending on persecutions, all kinds of stuff. So we will, in fact, get to where we're talking about concrete things and not just brain things. But as a teaser for next week, the one thing I want to throw out there is that, so there are all these things that make up Roman thought, right, which we've kind of talked about today, Roman thought and belief, philosophies, etc. Christianity actually ends up clinging onto or grabbing two very Hellenistic philosophies that become influential in how Christianity becomes Christianity. So the way we think. Okay, one of them is, you'll probably remember, Platonism, right? A guy named after a guy named Plato, a student of Socrates, who himself was essentially executed by the Roman state. Okay, Plato was not executed by the Roman state, but Platonism. Okay, we'll talk about Platonism next week. The other, you may have encountered, because our Scandinavian cultures, especially, agglomerating onto this, which is Stoicism. And this doesn't necessarily mean what you think it means. It's a little bit different than somebody who just doesn't have emotions. There's more to it than that. So these are the two kind of philosophical seeds that Christian, Platonism and Stoicism. And we're not going to dive too in depth, right? We're not going to explore Platonism. We need a lot more time than this. I'm not a qualified teacher. We're going to brush over these just so we kind of understanding these philosophical underpinnings, but especially more so why Christians do what they do, right? Because these two things end up feeding. All right.
Should we just throw out the green marker?
Oh, it's hard to see.
Yeah.
Well, we can go hang on to it.
I know because it's got.
Oh, I'll get more black markers.
We don't want to work.
Leave the table and the chairs tomorrow.
Take it to the line.
Car working all right?
Would there be a good time sometime for you to help me be able to get the sermon on my
Yes.